Are Jews, Israelites, and Israel the same thing? Are they different names for one people, or three different ideas across time? And why does this confusion still shape how people read the Bible today? If those words blur together in your mind, you are not alone. In many conversations, they are used as if they mean exactly the same thing, but when you trace the story carefully, the meaning shifts from one era to another, from family name to covenant people, from kingdom identity to modern nation-state language. But here's the thing. If we collapse all three into one label, we can miss the Bible's timeline, its promises, and its warnings. Tonight we are following one thread through scripture and history with caution, not hype. The thesis is simple. Jews, Israelites, and Israel are deeply connected terms, but they are not always interchangeable in biblical context, historical development, or modern political meaning. And the roadmap is clear. We begin with Jacob renamed Israel, then move through the 12 tribes and the kingdom split, then trace how Israelites increasingly became known as Jews, and finally examine the tension between the modern state of Israel and biblical Israel as a theological idea. First, Jacob renamed Israel is not just a dramatic scene, it is a naming event that becomes a people's identity. In Genesis, Jacob receives the name Israel after wrestling with God, and his descendants become the children of Israel. At this stage, Israel is first a person, then a family line, then a covenant community. That movement matters because later readers often jump straight to maps and borders, while the text begins with a patriarch and a promise. Second, the 12 tribes and the kingdom split complicate everything. The descendants of Jacob form tribal identities under one covenant story, but after Solomon, the united monarchy fractures into northern Israel and southern Judah. From that point on, terms are not always symmetrical. Northern Israel and Judah share ancestry, but follow different political paths, and eventually face different fates under foreign empires. Some details about tribal continuity and migration in this period are debated in popular retellings, but the split itself is central to the biblical narrative. Third, from Israelites to Jews marks a historical narrowing and survival identity. As exile, return, and imperial rule reshape the people, the term Jew becomes common, linked especially to Judah and later broader Jewish identity. That does not erase Israelite roots. It shows how identity language changes under pressure, memory, and worship, life centered on Torah, temple traditions, and community boundaries. Names evolve, but the covenant questions remain. Then we reach the hardest layer, modern state versus biblical Israel. The modern state of Israel, established in 1948, is a political nation in contemporary history. Biblical Israel includes theological themes of election, covenant, land, judgment, mercy, and restoration that Christians and Jews interpret differently across traditions. Equating these categories without care can produce confusion or overconfident claims. Distinguishing them does not erase faith, it protects clarity. So this is not about winning an argument in a comment section. It is about learning to read with reverence and precision. If words carry history, then names carry responsibility. Stay with me, and by the end, you will hear these three terms with sharper ears, steadier conviction, and far less confusion. When Jacob receives a new name in Genesis, are we watching a private spiritual crisis or the birth of a people's long identity? That one scene, often reduced to a dramatic wrestling match, quietly sets the foundation for the confusion we still carry. The text presents Jacob becoming Israel, and from him come the children of Israel. In other words, Israel begins not as a modern passport category, not as a parliament, not as a borderline on a 20th century map, but as a person whose story becomes a lineage, and that lineage becomes a covenant community. If we skip that sequence, we start reading backward, importing modern assumptions into ancient words. And once we do that, Every later debate gets louder and less precise. Notice how quickly language can harden. A name first attached to a patriarch turns into a collective term. A collective term, over centuries, turns into political shorthand. Political shorthand then gets treated as if it had exactly one stable meaning from Genesis to today. But that is not what the narrative itself gives us. Scripture gives movement, it gives progression. It gives moments where the same term can carry different weight depending on where you stand in the timeline. If we ask whether Jews, Israelites, and Israel are all the same thing, the first honest answer is that they are connected by story, bloodline memory, and covenant claims, yet they do not function as identical terms in every setting. There is also a spiritual layer here that should not be ignored. Jacob's renaming is tied to struggle, blessing, and divine encounter. The identity of Israel is never merely ethnic in the text, it is also covenantal and relational. That does not erase history, it deepens it. In medium pastoral terms, this matters because we are not dealing with labels only, but with a people repeatedly called to remember who they are before God. Names in Scripture are rarely decorative. They carry vocation, warning, and destiny language. So the question is not only what to call a group, but what a name claims about calling and responsibility. And yet, even at this early point, we should be careful with overconfident reconstruction. Details of chronology, exact roots, and harmonization between passages can be debated. Still, the main contour is firm. Israel begins with Jacob, expands through descendants, and enters history as a people under covenant memory. That is our first anchor. Without it, the later terms become detached fragments. With it, we can begin to see why the next phase changes the conversation even more, because one people does not remain one kingdom forever. What happens when a shared ancestry splits into competing political centers? The sons of Jacob become tribal structures, and eventually those tribes are bound within monarchy. Saul, David, and Solomon represent a united political phase in the biblical story. But after Solomon, the fracture between northern Israel and southern Judah introduces a fault line that still echoes through language. If one side is called Israel and the other is called Judah, what do later generations do with those names? Which term survives exile, conquest, memory, liturgy, and return? The kingdom split is not a side note, it is a linguistic turning point. Northern Israel and southern Judah share patriarchal ancestry, but they move through history under different administrative realities and different imperial pressures. The north falls to Assyria in the 8th century BCE in the standard reconstruction, while Judah later faces Babylonian conquest and exile. Popular retellings often flatten this into one dramatic collapse, but the sequence and distinctions shape how identity language develops. If you blur the split, you blur the birth of later terms. This is where viewers often hear about the so-called lost tribes. Some claims in that discussion move far beyond what can be verified and should be treated carefully. But even without speculative detours, one fact remains central to our thesis. After political rupture and imperial disruption, the social carriers of identity shift. Surviving institutions, scribal traditions, temple-centered worship patterns, and return communities do not preserve every tribal marker in the same way. Memory survives, but it does so through selected channels, and those channels influence vocabulary. So ask a contrast question. Is Israel in this period a theological umbrella, a political entity, or a remnant memory? In many texts, the answer can include more than one layer at once. That is exactly why simplistic one-to-one definitions fail. A term may point backward to covenant ancestry, while pointing sideways to a current regime, and forward to prophetic hope. The Bible can speak with that kind of density. Modern arguments often cannot. We prefer binary categories. But the narrative keeps resisting them. If that resistance feels frustrating, it may be because we inherited debates without inheriting timeline discipline. We hear one term and assume one meaning. But careful reading asks, when is this text speaking? To whom? Under what pressure? And with which memory of the split kingdom still active? Once those questions are allowed back in, the confusion starts to become legible. And as this political fracture settles into centuries of exile and return, another identity term begins to rise in prominence, carrying both continuity and narrowing at the same time. How do Israelites become widely known as Jews? Not by abandoning ancestry, but by passing through history. The term Jew is linked to Judah in origin, and over time, it expands in usage as communities shaped by exile, return, temple practice, Torah devotion, and later diaspora life carry forward a recognizably continuous identity. This development is historical, social, and theological. It is not a denial of earlier Israelite roots. It is one pathway by which those roots endure under changing conditions. Language here can mislead if used carelessly. Some people treat Israelite and Jew as if they were always perfect synonyms in every biblical century. Others treat them as unrelated categories. Both extremes distort. The continuity is real and the shifts are real. Identity survives through adaptation. After displacement and imperial administration, communities preserve memory through worship, law, family transmission, and textual tradition. Names that once mapped tribal political configurations now often map communal religious continuity. That transition is part of the story, not a corruption of it. There is also a caution for modern readers tempted to weaponize terms. If we force ancient words into contemporary ideological battles without historical sequencing, we create heat without light. The narrative arc from Jacob to tribes, to divided kingdoms, to exilic and post-exilic identity does not support lazy equivalence. It asks for precision with humility. A cautious documentary tone does not weaken conviction, it protects it from overreach. And if a claim sounds too neat, too total, too final, that is usually the moment to slow down and mark uncertainty. In pastoral terms, this is where reverence meets honesty. God's dealings with a people unfold through real history, and real history is textured. Faith does not require us to pretend complexity is betrayal. Sometimes faithfulness looks like patient naming. Calling things by their proper names can be an act of obedience, especially when sacred language has been dragged into slogans. Precision is not coldness. It can be a form of care for truth and for people. Now we move into the sharpest tension of all. What is the relationship between biblical Israel and the modern state of Israel established in 1948? If we say they are absolutely identical in every sense, we may collapse theology into geopolitics. If we say they are totally unrelated, we may erase historical continuity and living memory that many communities understand as deeply meaningful. The thesis of this episode asks for a narrower path. Related, yes. Interchangeable in every frame, no. Modern Israel is a nation-state in contemporary international history, with institutions, laws, security realities, and political conflicts like other states, though with unique historical burdens. Biblical Israel is also a theological category spanning covenant election, judgment, mercy, land promise traditions, prophetic critique, and restoration language interpreted differently by Jewish and Christian schools. These layers can overlap in discourse, but overlap is not sameness. Treating overlap as identity can generate confident claims that exceed what texts and history can jointly sustain. Consider a practical contrast. A policy decision by a modern government can be analyzed through legal and political frameworks. A prophetic text in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, or the 12 speaks in covenantal and theological grammar. Sometimes interpreters connect these domains directly. Sometimes they do so typologically or cautiously. Sometimes they reject direct mapping. The point is not to force one interpretive camp in this segment. The point is to show that mapping requires argument, not assumption. When assumption replaces argument, confusion sounds like certainty, and this is where the main dilemma returns with full force. Are Jews, Israelites, and Israel one thing or three different things? The most responsible answer is that they are one story with multiple identity layers unfolding across time. Shared roots do not erase historical transitions. Theological significance does not eliminate political distinction. Political reality does not cancel scriptural depth. Once these truths are held together, readers can stop swinging between reduction and denial. Here's what most people miss. Confusion over names does more than produce bad history. It can damage moral and spiritual discernment. If every use of Israel is treated as equivalent, then warnings, promises, laments, and hopes can be misapplied. If every distinction is exaggerated into separation, then continuity and covenant memory can be severed. Both errors are costly. One blurs everything into a single undifferentiated term. The other shatters the narrative into disconnected pieces. So what should a careful reader do? Begin with timeline before ideology. Ask what a term meant in that moment, in that text, for that audience. Track how exile, return, empire, and worship practice reshape communal language. Distinguish descriptive historical claims from theological interpretation, and do not present interpretation as if it were uncontested data. When uncertainty remains, leave room for it. Mark it. That discipline is not weak faith, it is intellectual integrity in service of faithful reading. A brief pastoral word before we close this section. Scripture invites devotion, but devotion without careful listening can turn sacred names into blunt instruments. If a name carries covenant memory, it also carries ethical weight. Speak it carefully, interpret it responsibly. Let humility guard conviction, not replace it. We began with a simple-sounding question and found a layered answer. Jews, Israelites, and Israel are tightly connected across ancestry, covenant memory, and historical development, yet they are not universally interchangeable in every biblical, historical, and political frame. Distinguishing them does not dilute faith. It sharpens interpretation. And if this distinction is true, then the next question becomes unavoidable. How do specific passages in the prophets and the New Testament use these terms? And what changes when we read those passages with this clarified map in hand? So where do we land after walking through Jacob's renaming, the divided kingdom, the shift from Israelites to Jews, and the modern state of Israel? Not in a simplistic yes or no, we land in a more demanding truth. These terms are intertwined, but they are not flat synonyms in every era. The first takeaway is that timeline governs meaning. In Genesis, Israel begins as Jacob's new name and then expands into a covenant people. After the kingdom split, political and regional distinctions reshape how names function. In later centuries, Jewish identity carries continuity through exile, return, and tradition. If we ignore sequence, we force one definition onto every text and call it certainty. The second takeaway is that continuity and distinction must be held together at the same time. If we erase continuity, we lose the long thread of ancestry, covenant memory, and scriptural inheritance. If we erase distinction, we collapse person, people, kingdom, and nation-state into one category and create interpretive confusion. That confusion is not harmless. It affects how readers approach prophecy, promise, judgment, land language, and moral responsibility. A careful reading does not weaken conviction, it disciplines conviction so that faith is guided by context instead of slogans. The third takeaway is that biblical Israel and the modern state of Israel overlap in discourse, but cannot be treated as automatically identical in every claim. The modern state belongs to contemporary political history. Biblical Israel also belongs to theological grammar that includes covenant, mercy, warning, restoration, and disputed interpretive traditions across communities. Direct one-to-one mapping is often asserted more confidently than it is demonstrated. That does not mean there is no relationship. It means relationship must be argued with precision, not assumed by vocabulary alone. And this brings us back to our main dilemma. Are Jews, Israelites, and Israel interchangeable labels, or distinct identity terms whose meaning shifts across biblical narrative, historical development, and modern politics? The answer this episode has argued is both sober and clear. They are historically and theologically connected, but not consistently synonymous in every frame. Careful distinction protects accurate interpretation without diminishing the seriousness of covenant claims. If that feels less dramatic than a viral hot take, that may be a good sign. Truth is not always loud. Sometimes it is patient, layered, and resistant to reduction. Sometimes the most faithful move is to slow down, locate a word in its own moment, and refuse to let urgency erase context. In a culture that rewards speed, careful naming becomes a form of integrity. A brief, pastoral reflection before we close. Sacred language deserves reverence, and reverence includes responsibility. When we speak about Israel, Jews, or Israelites, we are not handling empty labels. We are handling memory, suffering, promise, and hope across centuries. Precision is not a lack of devotion. In many cases, precision is devotion. Some questions will remain open, and that is honest. The exact continuity of certain tribal identities after exile is debated in both scholarly and popular frames. Specific prophetic applications to present political events are also interpreted differently across traditions. Marking these uncertainties is not doubt for its own sake. It is the discipline of refusing claims larger than the evidence can bear. So carry these three anchors with you. Follow the timeline. Hold continuity and distinction together. Separate theological language from automatic geopolitical equivalence unless the argument is carefully made. If you do that, the Bible does not become smaller. It becomes sharper. The story does not lose mystery. It gains depth. In the next episode, we step into the passages where this tension becomes explosive, because the same word can mean covenant people in one verse, political reality in another, and contested expectation in a third. Which readings are faithful, and which are imported from outside the text? If this helped clarify the map, subscribe and stay with us. Based on what we uncovered together in today's episode, answer this in the comments. Do you think biblical Israel and modern Israel should be interpreted as the same? And as always, God bless you.